Hello, this is our next webinar on policy issues, and we've kind of added some other terminology to that by suggesting this is not only policy issues, but policy issues and decision tools. We'll talk a little bit about how we proceed through that as we think about how we might handle public policy issues. When we think about public policy, I think it covers a really broad landscape, and we're going to narrow that down some of the things that we talk about here. But these are all things that are critically important as we think about how we interact with federal and state, but primarily, federal officials and public policy makers, politicians, as well as bureaucrats, and the things that reach down to the individual producer that's out there trying to make a living in this farmer ranch business. Policy in the way that we're going to talk about it today really covers three things. One of them is farm programs. Farm programs are established by the Farm Bill. And there are two really important components. There's actually a third component to that, which we're not going to talk about today, but two of them are price loss coverage. And we'll talk about the impact of that here in Montana more recently. And then agricultural risk coverage. Both of those are what they call shallow loss programs that are provided to farmers through legislation, and the most recent one of those being the Farm Bill that was passed in 2014. Secondly, there's additional legislation that gives us the ground rules for offering crop insurance. And we'll talk about crop insurance in a pretty simplified way. We'll talk a little bit about multi-peril crop insurance, which is typically what people buy in Montana. They might buy only yield insurance, and they might buy what we call revenue insurance, which covers you for lower prices as well as lower yields, where yield insurance would only cover you for the yield component of that. We'll also talk a little bit about disaster insurance. That comes in the form of something called NAP coverage, which is sold to you by the Farm Service Agency, and that really provides disaster insurance for either crop failures or for problems you might run into in grazing land. So really important coverage that's available there. And then thirdly, we have these other programs that sit in the background, and these are truly disaster programs. First of those is the livestock forage program. As we sit here today, there's actually a livestock forage program payments being made in Montana because of the drought. Livestock indemnity program is really a mortality program, where if you have mortality that exceeds your average, that you might experience in any particular year, then you can get some payments for these cattle that have died, or these added cattle that may have died. And thirdly, we have kind of a mop-up program called Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish. This really covers everything that would not lead to any indemnity being paid to you or any money being paid to you by the livestock indemnity program primarily. So we'll talk a little bit about the implications of that as we work our way through these things that I consider to be policy considerations. Now you can think about policy in a little bit, broader context too, about how you might influence policymakers and the things that they do for farms and ranches. That's kind of gets off in a little bit different tangent here, one we're not going to cover, but it's an important season right now. This is early in the Farm Bill process, and if you have a chance to go around and be a part of one of the listening sessions, they've had a few of those in Montana, I would encourage you to do that, because that allows you to have input into all of these things that we think about as farm policy. And some of these things you probably agree with are very good programs. And other ones you might think that they're probably things we might do to maybe make them better. Or for some of you, maybe to reduce the amount of these subsidy programs. So there's a lot you can talk about if you can spend a little bit of time going to the listening sessions and informing your congressmen and your senators what you think might be going on with these particular programs. Perhaps the most important one of these, at least in terms of legislation that's passed every 5 years, this comes in the form of the Farm Bill. And there's some terminology that's really important there. We'll take one short step back when we think about the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is really comprised of two things. One of them is the farm program part of that, which we're going to talk about here. But the other part, and frankly about 2/3 of the dollars that are spent in the Farm Bill, come in the form of food, food stamps or the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So when we talk about the Farm Bill, we're really talking, in our case here, about farm programs. But in order to get the Farm Bill passed through the House of Representatives in particular, it's really important that they have some of the components to that so that urban voters or urban congressmen in this particular case uh, will be willing to support something that's going to give them support in their urban areas. So we get into some interesting politics here as we think about the farm program part of that, the commodity program piece of that versus the program that's on the other side of that, which is more of a program for food stamps and providing supplemental nutrition assistance. So returning to the farm program piece of this, there are three pieces of this. We're going to talk about two of those. One of them was not utilized a lot in Montana, so we're going to kind of skip on by that. But first of those is the price loss coverage program. This is a program that was essentially price protection. And we'll see what that means here in a little while. But it essentially was setting some prices, price levels. And if it turned out that in the particular production year, if average prices, essentially from June through the following May, were below that threshold, then they'd get some money out of the farm program. This price loss coverage program would actually pay you something. Last year in Montana, just to give you an idea, these numbers just came out a couple of days ago, but this price loss coverage program paid almost just a little over $193 million to Montana farmers because prices were relatively low. In fact, they got in the wheat market, they got $1.61 per bushel. You might add that up on your own farm. That turns into some money. So that's one piece of the legislation. The second part is something called agricultural risk coverage. It's a little bit more complicated program because this is revenue protection rather than just price protection. So all we're doing is adding in that we will have a little bit of insurance here for a bad production year as well as a year when prices might not be so good. So you kind of get two pieces of protection here. And it can be, structured in a couple different ways. One of them is that your payment on the agricultural risk coverage program could come as a result of what's happened in your county. That's the most common way that this has been implemented. So if your county fell below some kind of revenue threshold, which we'll talk about in just a minute, then you'd be eligible for a payment. Or it could be what's happened on your individual farm. This is actually a piece of this legislation that was prompted by some very active advocacy here in Montana to try to make it look a little bit more like individual insurance. And so if you set a threshold for your farm and you fall below that particular threshold, you'd be eligible for a payment. So a couple different ways of getting to that. Last year, again, these payments that were just made a few weeks or in the past few days, there's about almost $20 million went to Montana producers under the ARC, or Agricultural Risk Coverage Program, which is a substantially different number than the PLC program, which turned out to be the most brought in the most revenue or additional revenue to Montana producers because it was nearly tenfold higher than it was over tenfold higher than agricultural risk coverage payments. The third piece of that was supplemental risk coverage, and there's very little of this sold in Montana, but essentially it's just another insurance product. And it essentially enabled producers that brought crop insurance to have some small component of the crop insurance, which really would cover up to 86% of their expected revenue. But for many producers, that probably increased their amount of insurance they were buying, but maybe the coverage by 10% or maybe a little less than that in a lot of cases. So not very much interest in that, so we're not going to talk about supplemental risk coverage. We'll talk a little bit about multi-peril insurance here in a few minutes. That'll give you an idea of how supplemental risk coverage works anyhow. What about these farm programs? Farm programs are really an important part of what goes on. We talk about them more than any other single component of the Farm Bill, I think, even though there's a little bit more to it than that, as you'll see here in just a minute. So anyhow, let's talk about this on a one crop, 1 year, 1 acre basis. So we're just going to break it down into 1 acre analysis, just to make it a lot easier to understand what's going on. So this is kind of how agricultural risk coverage works. And we'll go through an actual numerical example here in just a minute. But what you essentially do is you establish what we call a revenue guarantee for the county. It's based on the last 5 years of production in the county, which is collected by the National Agricultural Statistics Services. And then it's also based on 5 years worth of prices. But those prices are just national prices. Which is kind of bizarre for us to think about because in Montana we know that spring and winter wheat prices are very different from one another. But in the prices that are used for this particular program, it doesn't matter. Wheat to the bureaucrat sitting in Washington is just wheat. They don't differentiate between spring and winter wheat. So we have local production, national prices. So from that we calculate this thing called county. Uh, we from that we set a base, a benchmark, if you will. Then from that we look at our county revenue in the current year. We go through and we again the people over at NASS over here look at the production in the county. We grab national prices again. Local prices don't matter. And we determine whether the county looks worse than it would be in kind of a 5-year average. We'll talk about that in just a minute. If it looks like if it's going to be a little bit worse, then you're going to get a payment out of this. The payment becomes a little bit complicated because you're only going to get 10% of whatever this threshold that you've established, and that'll mean a little bit more to you in just a minute. But then the federal government has said, well, we're not going to pay 100% of that either. We're only going to pay you 86% of what we owe you. Essentially, we're going to pay you on 86% of your acres. So we get into some arithmetic here that gets a little funky is probably the best way to phrase it as you think about this. But as you hopefully in a few minutes here, you'll see kind of how these numbers work out. And it's a little complicated, but not too bad. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. We're going to move from left to right across this, and so hopefully you can kind of follow what I'm talking about. Okay, this is some county yield data from Montana, from a particular county. And in 2009, they got a little over 30 bushel, 30.5, 37 in 2010, and 21.5, and 11, 26.9, and 12, and 30.3 in 2013. And the bushel per acres that they had here are not all used. In fact, what we do is we use something like the Soviet Union might like to use in doing their computations for trying to determine who won the latest skating competition. We use something called an Olympic average. And the Olympic average in this particular instance here throws out the high and the low. So you notice 37 goes away and 21.5 goes away. So we end up with a Olympic average here of that uses the yield in 2009, 2012, and 2013, which turns out to be 29.2. Do the same thing with prices over here as well. And again, we're going to throw out the highs and the lows and keep the other three. And you notice here that we end up with 570, 724, and $6.87 as being the prices we're using. So what ends up happening is we take our Olympic yield, which is averaging those three numbers together, which is 29.2. We multiply it times the average price over those 5 years, which turns out to be $6.60. And we end up with a county benchmark number. This county benchmark number is $193.04. Now, this county benchmark number becomes really important because this is a number I was telling you before. You can't get any more than 10% of that per acre. And you'll see that's going to matter. Now, I told you that there's some factors that play into this as well. So your county revenue guarantee that they're going to allow you to use is going to be $166.01, or that's going to be 86% of that $193. So these are just kind of some budgeting justifications that are in this to kind of ensure that we have enough money in the Farm Bill to pay people off if indeed the Farm Bill, there is a disaster. So we look at county revenue. In this case, we're just looking at 2004, but in 2004, the actual yield was 28 bushel to the acre. In this county, the average market price was $3.89. and a market loan rate, which we don't care about in this case, because unless prices for wheat got below 294, we wouldn't worry about it. But if indeed that happened, we'd use the marketing loan rate to determine what the effective price was for this crop. Looks like the crop is in this particular county is worth $108.92. Now we go back and do a little bit of arithmetic here. We go back to this $166. From that, we subtract $128. Computer is moving along a little slow, or $108. So we end up with a difference between those two of $57. So we might think initially we're going to get $57 an acre for this. Well, the problem with that is that, as I told you before, you could only use up to 10% of the county benchmark, which is $193 and some change. So the most you're going to get out of this thing is $19.30. But you don't even get that because they're only going to pay you on some percentage of your acres. And in the current farm bill that we're in, not only are you losing 80, you're only getting 86% up from above, but you're only going to get 85% of whatever this gross payment is. So you're only going to get $16.41 out of this. So instead of getting $57, you're going to only get $16.41 out of the program. So those are the rules of the game for the Ark County program. The price loss coverage program is a lot easier to digest because it's just similar to something called the counter-cyclical payment programs that began a few years ago. And these programs are tied to how many base acres you have. And base acres means acres that you at least at one point in time had farmed in some of the program crops. Now, the interesting part about the Farm Bill is it doesn't matter whether you're still using the land for that or not anymore, but you can go ahead and retain those base acres. And from those base acres, you get some farm program payments out of that. The other part of this is that there are program yields attached to all of those acres as well. And we'll see here in a minute that those program yields are important because that will determine what your average yield is for your farm and will in fact impact the payments that you get out of this program. So this program is very simple. The federal government's chosen some numbers for wheat and barley and a whole bunch of other commodities. So we'll look at those in just a minute. We call those things reference prices. All we're going to do is pick that reference price, and if the price in this particular year falls below that in the marketing year, again, that's the marketing year between June of one year to May of the next year, falls below that trigger, you're going to get a payment from them. Now, it's pretty interesting. We're still using national prices as before, and the interesting part about this is not talked about a lot, but there are no upper bounds on this. There's no constraint. There's no 10% rule in this. There is if you earn gross income that's approaching $1 million, or excuse me, net income that's approaching $1 million, you're going to fall out of being able to take these payments. But there is no other constraint in this. So PLC payments can be pretty substantial. So what do those thresholds look like? Well, what you want to do is you want to look at the middle column, kind of the PLC payment trigger. That's where all the action's at here. The payment triggers that are over or left of that are the ones from the previous farm bill. But for this particular farm bill, look at these. $5.50 for wheat, and move down to the bottom, $4.95 a bushel for barley. So some pretty substantial prices there when you think about, at least where price levels are at right now. So what's this thing look like? Well, we can kind of looked ahead to what we might look at if we had realized the same thing in 2014 that we are right now. The effective price right now, and this is actual, real numbers here, is $3.89. That's what the average price for wheat was in the marketing year that applied to the farm payments for this year. That amounts to $1.61 for every bushel you produce. So these payment yields at 28 becomes really important for producers to think about, well, am I reporting the right numbers? Because there might be incentives to report either higher or low yield numbers, but relatively high yield numbers here make a difference, because that's how these payments are going to be made to you. In this particular instance, this person is going to be paid with the gross amount would be $45.10. You're going to apply the same rule as before to the ARC program. You're only going to get 85% of that. So you're going to get $38.22, but that's quite a bit better than the $16 that we looked at above. So the PLC program, is, as you saw in the outset of what I talked about here, has been a pretty big deal for producers in Montana this year, just because the difference between the trigger price of $5.50 and $3.89 is $1.61. That's about $1 or about 61 cents more than it was a year ago. So these are really important considerations. The other part of the farm program, and these are equally as important as what we've talked about with the ARC and PLC programs to this point, is that you could do some other things. And the two things that you were able to do, one was to update your yields. So what producers were able to do when the Farm Bill was passed and was implemented was that they could either keep their yields from before, which were really part of the 2008 Farm Bill, or they could decide that they wanted to go ahead and update them. And I'm not going to take you through all the arithmetic on updating, but it's really a pretty simple standard. What you did is you took your yields from 2008 to 2012, and these turned out to be planted acre yields, not harvested acre yields. And you'd be able to use the average yield across that period of time. So if you had a year where you didn't plant it, that didn't figure into your average. But you could take those and add them up, divide by the number of years that you actually planted something out there on that property, and then take 90% of that, and that would be your new program yield. That was pretty interesting. I did a number of these when I was out working across Montana for the Farm Bill, and there are probably a little over half of the producers actually updated their yields. Their yields before, their current yields that they had on the books were better than the yields that they'd had over this 2008 to 2012 span, at least average yields over that period of time, because some of them had, some production problems along the way and other things that had happened. For younger farmers, it's important that they have some other things to depend on here as well. In years that you have relatively low yields, you have the opportunity of substituting 75% of the county yield in that slot. So that helps out a lot of people in terms of having planted and having to take something very close to zero, which is going to, of course, have a huge impact on your average, since you're only averaging your across a short period of time. So there's some rules of the game that allow you to do some substituting of yields to bump your yields up a bit. So yield updating was a really important consideration in the Farm Bill, and actually I will tell you that in working with farmers, it oftentimes took more time to get through the yield updating option part of this than it did to actually help people with the farm program choices. The other thing you could do was to reallocate your base acres. That sounds like some pretty technical sort of language, but it was something pretty simple, really. It was some farms, not all farms, had base acres that were in the farm program before. And that base acres that you might have had in the farm program before could have been, say, divided between something like wheat and barley. Maybe you had 100 acres of wheat and 100 acres of barley. But you had the opportunity now, when this new farm program came along, to go ahead and change those base acres. So maybe you just said, well, what the heck, looks like this wheat might pay better than barley over the life of this Farm Bill, so I'm going to go ahead and switch my base acres. I'm going to put all of my base acres into wheat. Actually, when we were doing the Farm Bill sort of work on this particular issue, it was just flipped around the other way. Barley prices looked like they were going to be the big deal, and wheat prices not such a big deal. So a lot of people switched over from wheat to barley. Turned out by the time the first year was over, barley prices had gone up a bunch, and wheat prices had not done so well. So they didn't get anything out of the barley. They would have got a little bit out of the wheat program. So anyhow, you never know. But anyway, that's what you could do. You could go ahead and move base acres around. And so what happened here in moving to base acres is a little more complicated than just making that choice. they made some choices like that in Cotton Arena and some other places. But for us in Montana here, what you had to do was a little bit of arithmetic. And this reallocation required you to put your acres that you had planted from 2009 to 12 into a little matrix. And then you could go ahead and reallocate based on kind of the average, the acres that you had planted over that period of time. So in order to do what I told you about before, where you want to switch it all over to wheat, that would only be in the instance where you had a producer that hadn't planted any barley. Then they could make that transition, but not otherwise. They had to follow this reallocation rule. So what you planted, your historical planting really had really some important impacts on how these base acres could be reallocated. Now, I think there was some misconception among some producers thought they could actually increase base acres on their farm. That was not true. You just could not do that. All you could do is reallocate. This is a decision that had to be made by the owner of the farm. So if you were in a leasing situation, you had to have the owner sign off on this because it had some pretty important implications once you start moving your base acres around and deciding what crops are going to be attached to those. So that was the farm program. A matter of providing some shallow loss insurance was item number one. Secondly, to re-estimate your yield, your program yields. And then lastly, to go ahead and reallocate your base acres. So quite a bit of flexibility in what was going on there to, kind of reconfigure your farm, if you will, at least in terms of what the Farm Service Agency viewed as this farm of yours and how you might be setting yourself up for farm payments. The other part of farm policy is crop insurance. And crop insurance is a really important component of farm policy because crop insurance is a subsidized product, as we economists like to think about that. And it's a product that's out there that the farmer pays premium, but the premium does not pay the full actuarial value of the insurance, plus whatever administrative costs there might be. So what ends up happening is that other taxpayers end up subsidizing this product that's available to farmers called crop insurance. And some of the subsidy rates run pretty high. It depends on what product you're talking about, but we might pick a number that's around 60% to think about what would be a pretty average subsidy on at least the kinds of insurance, crop insurance that a Montana farmer might buy. So why do you buy insurance? Well, for the same reasons you buy car insurance. I mean, this is if something happens to you, you want to be able to have somebody help share in that risk with you. And you can think about this last year that we've had in Montana, a really classic example of when crop insurance is important. We've had poor crop yields and we haven't had very good prices. And so producers that have crop insurance are going to be able to recoup really a substantial part of the revenue that they expected from this crop just because they had purchased either yield or price or revenue insurance to help them through more difficult times. Crop insurance is based on the actual yield on your farm and market prices that are available out there. These are all things that have to be reported to your insurance agent, and these are all on record. If you want to go look and see what the insurance company knows about you, just go look at the insurance records that are held in these offices and give you a really good picture of what's happened to this farm over some period of time. This management agency is the people that administer this this program for the federal government, although the insurance is just sold through independent insurance agents. Probably have one in your community that's involved in selling crop insurance. So how does this work? Well, we'll just take a look at some irrigated spring wheat here just as an example. And we're just going to work our way right straight down this page. So bear with me, but you might want to have your pencil handy so you can scribble on this just a little bit to make sure you understand where these numbers are coming from. So the price forecast is actually, provided to RMA by some organization that looks at futures prices in particular months and looks at those in a particular month and then looks at forward futures prices, and from that come up with these things called RMA price forecasts. And in our particular case here, we have this wheat that we're going to be selling is worth $4.74 a bushel. So we know up right up front what the RMA thinks the value of this wheat that we're going to be producing is going to be. And, it could be higher or lower than that. And it's always going to be the case. It's never going to be exactly on that. So, but at any rate, this is the best guess. And the APH yields 100 bushel to the acre. This is all going to be based on farm records, by the way. You just don't pick these you pick them out of the hat. They're just based on your own records on the farm. So the maximum revenue that you can then generate off of this would be $474 if you, in fact, your expected maximum revenue is going to be the $4.74 times the 100 bushel to the acre. So you're going to get $474 per acre. Your revenue election on this thing, though, you're only going to be able, at least in our example here, to buy insurance up to 75% of that. So at 75% of that, you're only going to be able to, the maximum amount of money you're going to get out if you had a complete disaster would be $355 and some change. So keep in mind, what would you sooner have, a good production year where you're getting 474, or, a year like this year where some farmers didn't get anything, and they're going to have to settle for the maximum amount that they're going to be paid would be the 355. The other thing that plays into this, and it plays in differently and depending on what insurance policy you have, but let's say that the harvest price is $4.50. It wasn't 474. We overestimated. The actual yield on our operation out there was only 50 bushel to the acre rather than 100. So the actual revenue that we generated off of that was only $225. Keep in mind that we thought we were going to get 474, and we only bought coverage for 355, but we ended up well below that at 225. So what do we get? Well, we get the difference between the revenue guarantee, which was the 355, and the actual revenue we produced off of that. So we're going to get $130.50 out of the insurance. So that's better than not receiving better than not receiving only the 225, but it's not as good as if we'd had a good production here and gotten 474 either. But the $130 comes with some conditions attached to that because we have to pay a premium. And the premium is going to essentially be 6% of whatever the revenue guarantee is here. And so we're going to pay about $21, a little bit more than that per acre for this insurance. And the farmer is going to pick up some percentage of that, and we as taxpayers are going to pick up some percentage of that. The net payment that the farmer is going to get out of this, though, is going to be $109.17. After he gets his indemnity payment out of this, he's going to pay his premium. The premium rate for this particular farmer is only 6% of whatever the revenue guarantee is. That's far below the actuarial value of this. But he's going to walk away with $109 tacked onto the $225 he received for the actual revenue by taking the wheat he produced to the elevator. So the insurance has provided an important sort of safety net for him in this farming operation. So multi-peril insurance is really purchased by many farmers, not all of them. There are many producers here that don't buy any crop insurance at all for various reasons. But if you do buy crop insurance, you do get some protection that looks like this. And I was talking to a student earlier today on their farm. They'd gone for nearly 10 years without ever having to take an insurance payment or getting paid by an insurance company, and had decided that maybe buying insurance wasn't the best thing to do. But with their better judgment, prevailing, they decided to buy insurance this year, and it turned out to be a really important decision for them because they had no production on many of their wheat acres. So this 1 year out of 10 was provided some really important financial safety net to them. So insurance, you buy it so you can share the risk with somebody else. And the best scenario is if you have that $474 so that you're able to create off of this property and not have to take any indemnity. That's always the best. You don't want to have disasters, but it's to purchase insurance, there is a cost attached to that. There is some insurance you can buy out there that all you really pay is an administrative fee. You're really not paying for the insurance value of that, and that is called non-insured crop disaster assistance program. This is a program that's actually done by the Farm Service Agency. It's not through RMA, the Risk Management Agency. And the terminology here is really pretty important. NAP provides financial assistance to producers of non-insurable crops. So you can't go buy NAP coverage for wheat or barley or any program crops that are out there. You just can't do that. To protect against natural disasters that result in lower yields or crop losses or prevents crop planting or prevented crop planting. All those things are important there, but the most important part of this is these have to be non-insurable crops. You can't have any crop insurance programs that are available through the Risk Management Agency, or you don't qualify for NAP insurance. So how does NAP insurance work? You probably had to take a big breath when you saw this thing pop up here, because we're going to go through yet another example of how this insurance might work out for you. But you find it's kind of an interesting product, really. We're going to look at a little bit of hay, alfalfa hay here. And we'll just work ourselves right straight down through the middle of this. Okay. This is a case where this individual owns it all. We're not sharing this hay with any landowner. We're the tenant, landowner. We're all one and the same. So we don't have to worry about sharing it with anyone. The approved yield on this is 2 ton to the acre. So some, kind of dryland alfalfa hay sort of story. The yield coverage that we can take out on this hay is only 50%. We can't buy above that, or we can't ask for more than that. That's the maximum amount of coverage available to us. There's another program available through NAP that allows buy-up coverage. We're not going to cover that today, but you can do some things where you actually pay premiums to get additional coverage, but we're not going to pay any premiums here. We're just going to pay some administrative expenses. So it turns out that our coverage then is 50% of the 2 tons, so we only have 1 ton worth of coverage. We're on line number 4. So the production to count is some kind of unusual language, but what that means is, what was your production from this past year? Well, our production this past year was only 0.6 of a ton. So that's well below the 2 ton we expected, and it's also below the 1 ton that we have coverage for. So our net production for payment is going to be based on 0.4 of a ton. It's going to be the 1 ton that we had coverage for, but remember, we got 0.6 of a ton of hay out of that. So we have 0.4 that we're going to get an indemnity. We're going to get a payment from the insurance for that. And what price are they going to pay? Well, FSA has set a price on that of $104. That's for this year, $104 a ton. But you only get 55% of that, of the price. So, you're getting a little over $55 a ton based on 0.4 of a ton of hay that you're going to get paid for here. Don't worry about the payment factor. This has a matter of what percentage of it's been harvested, but we'll assume that's just 1. There is no salvage value, so don't worry about that either. So we get a calculated net NAP payment per acre down here of $22.88 per acre. So we had 0.4 of a ton of alfalfa hay here, and we're going to get paid right around $55 a ton for that. It's a little more than that. So it turns out that we had a couple hundred acres planted in this hay crop. In fact, I guess I needed to clarify myself. We really are talking about barley hay rather than alfalfa hay in this instance. But 200 acres. So out of that 200 acres, we're going to get about $4,500 or a little more out of that, just because we were able to go in and enroll for this insurance product, which protected us. Not very good protection, because it only gave us 50% of our yield and 55% of the price of alfalfa hay, but it was, better than poke with a sharp stick. You know, it was still money that was available to you. And probably the best part of this is that all you had to do is walk in and pay $250 the Farm Service Agency, and you're all set to go. You didn't have to. There's no other premium attached to this. So for many of you that especially people with grazing land and growing other crops that don't fall into the RMA sort of umbrella, this is a great way to get a little bit of disaster protection. You know, don't misread this. This is kind of disaster protection levels here, but can be really important coverage if you end up with a year like we had this year, where there was a lot of hay and pasture land in particular that just didn't produce anything. So people were able to get payments off of this disaster program to help supplement their income. Now, payments pay off some. I mean, it's one of the challenges in getting people to sign up for this is, they say, well, doesn't look to me like any of my neighbors got any money out of it. This is Fergus County. Look over on the left. These are number of payments. That's not very many. Even in 2011, there were 18 producers in Fergus County got some money out of this. In 2014, which is the last data I had, only 7 people got money out of it. But on the other hand, for those people that need something to undergird what's going on in their business to make sure they don't hit that year when they just don't have any revenue, NAP insurance can be a good thing. NAP payment values is relatively small as well, only $40,000 in the highest year that Fergus County has had in the last several years, and then a little over about 12,500 or so paid out in 2014. With average values, this is average per farm, in 2014 only about $1,700, $1,800. So again, this is not very good sales data when you're going out trying to talk to somebody into going in and signing up for this, but it doesn't take too much effort. You can sign up for 1 acre or 1,000 acres of a particular thing that's going on in your operation. It's still going to cost you $250. So a pretty good way to get a little bit of disaster insurance. Disaster programs are another really important component of farm policy. I think there's a fair bit of discussion going on now, I think, around these disaster programs and how important they are and what kind of producers are really benefiting. But I think disaster programs are perhaps some of the most important sort of safety nets that undergird the farm and ranch operations. We'll talk a little bit about a few of these. One of the programs that's available now is actually, as per the last Farm Bill, is something called the Livestock Forage Disaster Program. This compensates eligible livestock producers who have suffered grazing losses on land that is native or improved pasture land. The grazing losses must be due, and this is really important, to a qualifying drought condition. Talk about what that means here in just a minute. During the normal grazing period for the county. So, it's drought that when cattle are out grazing and doesn't do you very much good if I'm talking about winter time. Obviously, you're going to be grazing your cattle out there. You're going to be having them in close to the sheds and feeding them some hay. So what's this all mean? Well, this is what the drought map looks like for Montana for this year. This is a remarkable story, let me tell you. We've never seen anything like this in my years. I haven't worked for Extension for a long time, but I have worked for them for the last 11 years. I've seen nothing that even closely resembles this. The very dark red is areas of Montana that are under what they call an extraordinary dry or extraordinary drought. The red areas are extremely dry. These really extreme drought conditions. You get over to the gold over in the western part of the state, this is severely dry, and then finally to the brown is moderately dry. 100% of Montana's eligible for some payments from the livestock forage program. Now, we used to think about this in some really very kind of negative terms in past years because we had only portions of counties that were relatively dry. An example is Judith Basin County. Just a little sliver of Judith Basin over on the western part of the state, or the western part of the county, was dry. But the whole county qualified for these livestock forage program payments, and really the rest of the county, from way over in the western part of the county all the way across to the eastern side, really had more moisture than they knew what to do with. Had some of the best pasturing conditions they'd had in years. but they got the same payments as people over in the western part of the county. So those are the issues you get around any policy like this, is that sometimes there are those conditions that are there that you might argue are a little unfair to some people and subsidizing, people that probably don't need the subsidy because they're really not experiencing the event. But that's just the challenge. You have to draw your line somewhere, and county boundaries that's how these programs are administered. It's a little bit more complicated than that because it's actually wherever you're administered with FSA, and depends, kind of where you live. Some people will live in one county, but administered out of an FSA in another county. But that's going to determine, again, where these drought payments go. So what about this? Sheridan County, it's an exceptionally dry county. You all know where that's up in the far northeastern part of Montana. You can see it's a nice dark brownish red color up there. So what happens if you lived in Sheridan County right now? Well, you're going to get this drought payment, and my number's going to be pretty close here. I worked off of some numbers that I have, but you can essentially get about $30 a cow for 5 months. You're going to get the maximum amount that this program pays. And this amount that they're paying to you is really based on kind of what they come up with is 50% of whatever the monthly feed costs are. It's kind of interesting. This formulas I use to come up with this are really based on corn rather than the things we grow here in Montana. But at any rate, come up with 50% of monthly feed costs. Turns out that's about $30 a cow. You get that for 5 months, you're going to get $150 a cow. Did you have grazing out there? Of course, if this cow has a calf that's attached to it, you're going to get some additional money for that, what we would classify as an immature adult, and so on through the entire herd. And so you have to let FSA know what you have out there, and they're going to pay you in accordance to that. So it turns into money. $150 per cow helps you then buy what you need to get through a severe drought like that we're having in eastern Montana. The other part of this policy program is something called the Livestock Indemnity Program, and this is really a mortality story rather than one that has to do with drought, even though, as we all know, if dry enough conditions persist for long enough, all of a sudden you're going to get into problems with abnormal mortality as well. So you might get some money out of the livestock forage program, but also get money out of this program if indeed you're losing livestock. But we got to think about how that works. Well, it compensates eligible livestock producing contract growers for eligible death loss in excess of normal mortality caused by adverse weather event. Okay. For Montana, the most recent one of those was snow rather than drought conditions, or attacks by animals introduced into the wild by the federal government or protected by federal law, including wolves and avian predators. So there's some pretty specific language in there about when this livestock indemnity program is going to pay. But what is this thing based on? Well, it's based on whatever your normal death loss is. So you've got to be able to prove that to FSA that your normal death loss is some number. And just say, for example purposes here, it's 5%. So every year you're going to have 5% of your cattle herd, or your cows specifically, that are going to die for some other reason. And but in this particular year, you had this snowstorm blew through, and instead of losing only 5, you lost 10 of your cows. If you had a herd of 100 cows, you've lost 10% of it. So what happens then? Well, you're going to get a payment for these 5 cows that have now died. There's a rate chart that's out. If you look at the very bottom of this slide, you want to look at that, how much you're going to get for each one of these cows. So we have 5 cows rather than 5 calves here, but 5 cows that have died that we're going to get some indemnity for, and we're going to get a little over $1,000 for each one of them. Back to 2000 rate, it was $1,000, $1,038.73 for each cow above your normal mortality rate. So this particular ranch is getting a little over $5,000 on the livestock indemnity payment based on what is on this mortality that's occurred. So the LIP program is another program that provides an important safety net for livestock producers that may have gone through a situation where they've had some adverse weather that has rolled in and inflicted a substantial loss on them. There is a MAPA program here that's called the Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish. It's called ELAP. I think almost everybody that is talking to people about this insurance product really views it as when nothing else will pay, the ELAP is sitting in the wings to help you survive some of these losses. So let's just take a look here. ELAP provides financial assistance to eligible producers of livestock, either people that produce it or people that contract to produce it, honeybees, and farm-raised fish for losses due to the following: for diseases, certain adverse weather events, or loss conditions, including blizzards and wildfires, as determined by the Secretary of Agriculture. So the Secretary of Ag, Sonny Perdue, is the one that's going to make the call on whether they're going to allow emergency assistance dollars to be paid for things that have occurred, in your area. ELAP assistance is provided for losses not covered by other disaster assistance programs. So this is the mop-up nature of this particular program. So when we think about farm policy, this is kind of the way I like to think about it in terms of the Farm Bill. And the decision, there's some significant number of decision tools that went along with this. We just talked about these in general terms, but we had, base acre reallocation, yield updating, agricultural risk coverage, price loss coverage, and then supplemental coverage option, which we didn't cover any of that other than to talk about it kind of in the terms of multi-peril crop insurance. And then the NAP program, which provides some support for you when you can't buy insurance for any of your for the crop of interest. So we have all of this structure that's around the fringes of what we do with farm programs, and I think policy takes on a very wide swath in many ways in the way that we want to think about it, because we have all of these programs here. Go back to my second slide here. All of these programs that become part of this complex of what we think about is farm policy. Now, how do these rank with one another? I think that's pretty hard to go through and put a rank order on these, but I think if you were to look across expenditures, the importance of these crop insurance is really important to producers across a broad swath of producers throughout the U.S. So that's really critically important. When we think about farm programs, I like to think about them in terms of just shallow loss programs or shallow insurance programs. That's essentially kind of where they fit. So we have two products that look an awful lot like insurance in terms of the farm program and obviously crop insurance that someone might buy. The other part of that, though, is another set of insurance, if you will, but not really insurance in the sense that you're not paying any premiums for it, with NAP coverage, and then also with all the disaster program money, because you have the livestock forage program, indemnity program, and emergency assistance or ELAP program that sits behind that to provide this kind of final safety net, if you will. I think especially important to livestock producers, that sits underneath all of the other farm programs that are out there in case things really hit the skids and you've really experienced a major farm disaster of some sort related to adverse weather conditions or other things that might have occurred on the farm. So that's the kind of the way I think about these. But all of them are really critical pieces of what we think about farm policy and the policy that works for producers. At the outset, I talked about the other component of that. That's just influencing policy makers, primarily your politicians, about what you think is good or bad in farm programs. And really, we're in that listening period stage right now where you can go to those meetings and give them your 2 bits on what you think about farm programs, crop insurance, and about the disaster programs that are available, and how you might think these might be improved. That's kind of the task that might be in front of you as a producer to provide some input to that. So with that, that's our our policy discussion. And this will be about as much as we talk about with farm policy in the programs that we do. We'll talk about some other programs that are available for people thinking about ownership and providing operating money for their farm or ranch. Those also become part of the policy. There's important decisions that are made within the bureaucracy, primarily with Farm Service Agency, but we'll talk about those at a later date. But so with that, have a good day. Yeah, yeah, you can answer that. Yeah.